Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Asuma Katauka and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. As world leaders gather in Egypt for the Gaza Peace Summit, and with the Israel-Gaza ceasefire in effect, despite efforts, Gaza faces devastation and urgent humanitarian needs, with displaced Palestinians, Gazans returning to home that have been reduced to rubble, while simultaneously West Bank tensions and Israeli crackdowns undermine regional stability. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump has warned Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu against annexing the West Bank, as questions resurfaced over a two-state process and lessons from failed peace initiatives reshape the path ahead. To talk about this, joining us now is Tahani Mustafa, visiting fellow in the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She has extensive experience on security, political, and legal governance in the West Bank. She previously served as senior Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group and holds a PhD in politics and international studies from SOAS University of London. Today, she discusses the Gaza Peace Summit in Egypt, Trump's 20-point peace deal, challenges, humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and prospects for a two-state solution. Thank you for joining us, Tahani Mustafa. Welcome to NewsX World. We're delighted to have you. Now, my first question to you is, world leaders from 20 countries are gathering in Egypt now for the Gaza Peace Summit, with the aim of ending the war and achieving peace and stability there in the Middle East. What are your expectations for the outcomes of this high-profile gathering?
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I think the summit itself is much more symbolic than it is substantive. I don't think we should, or at least we should be cautiously optimistic about what can actually come out of this, especially given that these very states that are partaking haven't really been able to iron out any of the more substantive issues in the last 2 years that have been sticking points to any substantive ceasefire deal between either Israel or Hamas. So I think this is far more ceremonial than it is in terms of just coming up with something that's actually operationally workable, especially given that one of the most critical key stakeholders here that can either be a facilitator or spoiler is completely absent from the room. And what you do have is states that are trying to dictate terms of an agreement that is incredibly one-sided, and that they themselves, I'm sure, are well aware is not going to be something that will be acceptable to the Palestinian side. But yet there's been really no effort to substantially engage them. And that can really make or break a deal like this, especially given as it stands now, which for many Palestinians looks more like a deal of capitulation, very reminiscent of the Oslo Accords, than a serious peace agreement. And that's something Hamas itself have openly stated is a red line for the movement.
And Tahani, now the Gaza ceasefire deal has been finalized, but some elements of this 20-point plan remain contentious. In your assessment, what could emerge as sticking points in negotiations down the line?
Well, I think the 20-point plan is less of a plan. I think it's more the contours of a potential plan. But there isn't really any substantive detail to each of the points raised within that. So, that's really where I think that in itself requires substantive negotiations, which you're not going to end up seeing. And right now, it seems to be borrowing a lot from the plan that Tony Blair himself had proposed prior to that, which again is very reminiscent of a capitulation deal more than anything else. And within that, there's a lot of focus on not so much around the technocratics of what governance should look like in Gaza, but more who can govern Gaza, who can represent Palestinians. And a lot of that is being relegated to an international board of advisors who have either no experience of governing Gaza or have really no, let's say, neutral history or political leanings in this conflict, and many of those openly do have very Zionist leanings. I think many have fixated on the figure of Tony Blair, but there are many other problematic individuals involved in that board of peace that Trump is envisioning. Worse yet, this plan also looks to separate the West Bank and Gaza, creating what I think many Palestinians have feared for the last 2 years, which is going to be an entirely separate administration for Gaza, and where you'll end up seeing potentially not just territorial segregation, but also institutional separation. And that really does nothing if we're looking towards a two-state solution, or some kind of peace process that could lead to a two-state solution. And then again, dictating the terms as to who can and can't represent Palestinians, what Palestinians can and can't feel towards their occupiers. It doesn't really deal with Gaza in the context of an occupation in any case. It doesn't openly call what the kind of control that it will relegate to Israel in occupation. But ultimately, what it does do is cements Israeli control over Gaza's air, land, and sea space, and economy, and now politics.
Right. And Tahani, also many displaced Gazans are returning to homes that have been reduced to rubble. Hospitals too have been razed after continuous bombardment, while much of the discourse is focusing on post-war reconstruction, so which in itself will be a long drawn process. So what are the most urgent needs that must be addressed immediately on the ground?
Well, I think you raise a really good point there, and I think that is also very much testament to whose interest this ceasefire really serves, and how little there is for Palestinians, either in the immediate term or longer term. In the immediate term, I think the two main issues that were really sort of focused upon were hostage handover and Israeli withdrawal, but there really wasn't much consideration given to things like aid, humanitarian assistance, and very much kind of rubble removal, trying to allocate missing persons and so forth, and really just addressing the more immediate humanitarian needs. That was something that had been given, shockingly, very deficient attention to. So, I think that's something that Gazans themselves are already now trying to grapple with, just in terms of, conducting rescue missions, in terms of trying to just enforce law and order now, where you have Israeli proxy gangs that are trying to very much disrupt that or act as disruptors. So there's a lot in the immediate term that Gazans do require, and I think has been very much relegated to Gazans themselves, with Israel and the US really just blocking any kind of international initiatives that were pushing for those kind of relief efforts to be incorporated into any ceasefire agreement. We saw that back in January, we saw that in November 2023, and we see that again here.
And now President Trump has recently warned Netanyahu against annexing the West Bank. In your opinion, what factors or developments have prompted this warning by the US?
Well, I think we have to be very mindful of Trump's public posturing here. His administration haven't really given much in the way of any kind of hope that they will actually rein Israel's capacity in when it comes to annexation in the West Bank. I don't think we can expect annexation to be this kind of grand moment where Israel announces it. It's already doing it, and it's been doing it at quite an accelerated pace since Trump came into power. If anything, actually, Trump's presidency emboldened a lot of far-right ministers to proclaim 2025 as the year that they're going to exert Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank, and they're doing just that. We've seen the largest land grabs in the history of the conflict. We have seen settler violence see a massive uptick. We have seen Palestinian fatalities now in the West Bank alone start to outnumber those that we saw during the Second Intifada. We're seeing mass arrest campaigns. We're seeing the largest displacement since 1967. We're seeing entire neighborhoods razed to the ground. We're seeing Israel redraw the maps of what Palestinian localities look like, what they are now designated as, where they're redefining entire neighborhoods and refugee camps and cities and towns and villages, where they are quite literally imprisoning Palestinians Palestinians in their own towns and villages through the building up things like metal fences, erecting, I think something now, like since the 7th of October, it's been something like 900 checkpoints, makeshift checkpoints. Many of those have become permanent fixtures across the West Bank. Israel has deployed numerous mechanisms to annex territory, and that includes things like institutional, legal, structural changes, as well as quite literally directly displacing Palestinians off their own land and declaring them as military or security zones. So we're already seeing that process underway. And I think from Trump's speech today, there's been absolutely no indication that he's going to do anything substantive to actually rein in Israel's capacity. You can make all these sort of rhetorical statements all you want, but if you're not going to actually back that with any serious tangible measures, then it really doesn't mean much.
And now, does this moment open a window towards a two-state process?
Unfortunately not, and Israel has done everything it can to ensure that there will not be a two-state solution here. The first, I think, you can just, it's not just Israel's practices in the West Bank that have literally left Palestinians. I mean, you're no longer talking about territorial disruption, but quite literally territorial separation now, where you now have a north, south, and center that are completely all three cut off from each other, where they have weakened the PA to the point where quite literally governance has become so localized out of necessity, where you now have an oversaturation of NGOs that are having to pick up where the PA cannot, operationally speaking, access its own territories under its control, and where it's not able to provide the very bare minimum of what service provision or service delivery should look like. And then in the context of Gaza, they've made sure to secure a deal, potentially, that will ensure that you can no longer talk about the occupied territories as forming one contiguous state if we're going to have two separate administrations that are institutionally as well as territorially separated.
And Tahani, lastly, what lessons can be learned from previous international peace efforts in Gaza when implementing the current plan?
Well, I think, it is worth considering from previous peace efforts what the Israeli vision of peace looks like and how that's been operationalized over the decades. And for Israel, and they've made no secret about it, I think even more so now, but they make no secret about it. For Israel, they've never envisioned Palestinian sovereignty. For them, it's always been about devolution of powers, Palestinian autonomy as opposed to sovereignty, where Palestinians can effectively provide the very bare basics of service provision like health, sanitation, policing. Again, policing being done in the service of Israeli security rather than Palestinian security, but things like security, health, sanitation, education, but they can never expect to have control over the land itself. They can never expect to have control over their own land, air, and sea space, over their own economy. Israel has always been able to dictate who is able to represent Palestinians, who their leaders are, and has always tried to effectively define the concept of Palestinian agency. That's always been something that's been integrated in practically every peace deal since the 1970s. And that's something that is, being very much echoed in this recent ceasefire agreement now. The only difference is that I think for the first time in the history of this conflict, Israel is up against an adversary that is absolutely unrelenting in certain demands that they haven't really come up against before, neither with Fatah or leaders prior to that.
Wow. Thank you so much, Tahani, for sharing that. You've enlightened me so much, and for joining us today once again and sharing your insight. It's been a pleasure having you on Focal Length. With that, it's a wrap on this episode of The Focal Length. For more international news and updates, stay tuned on NewsX World.